Hello, if you're just joining us for our webinar this afternoon, we're just waiting for a few more minutes for more people to join. You're very welcome. We're glad that you're here. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're just waiting a minute or two till more people have joined us. You're very welcome from wherever you are. Please put who you are in the chat box and where you've joined us from. We always like to know who's with us, and you've all become old friends now. Hi, Liz Madigan, my colleague and friend. Good that you're here. Okay, so it's just a minute past the hour. People are still joining, but I think we're going to get going because we only have an hour and a half, as always, for these webinars. Greetings to all of you. You're so welcome to this webinar, which is the last in our advocacy series, which has been running since the beginning of February. In fact, we're coming towards the end of the Nursing Now campaign. So you're all invited to our very last ever event, which is the 24th of May. And don't forget to get yourself signed up for that because places are limited. We're also going to be launching our final report on the 18th of May, and you're going to have a chance to sign up for that as well. So please keep an eye out for those and for the ongoing Nursing Now Challenge webinars. But for today, welcome to our webinar on nurse migration. We had a lot of people signing up for this webinar, which I think indicates exactly how popular and of concern this subject is. And this afternoon, we have a stellar lineup of people to talk about migration from several different perspectives, because the way you look at migration of anybody, nurses included, depends very much on who you are and what you see in the whole migration process. I'm Barbara Stillwell. I'm the Executive Director of Nursing Now. For those who don't know me, I know that many of you have been on our webinars over the last 3 years and have become friends of the campaign, and for that we thank you. I've got this afternoon a great panel. I first became interested and aware of health worker migration when I worked at the World Health Organization in the 1990s. And nurse migration became something of a hot topic at that time, for all the reasons that it's still a hot topic. But that, for me, was the time at which I began to lead a team at WHO working on migration and really began to look at the numbers and the effects of migration and understand some of the complex issues around migration of health workers and of nurses in particular. So that's what we want to dig into this afternoon. We have 4 speakers who are going to talk about it. And the first speaker is Professor Jim Buchan from Edinburgh, the Global Nursing Institute and at Edinburgh University, and he's also a visiting professor in Australia. I've known Jim since those heady days at WHO when we both worked on migration together with a little team, and we have continued to work together on and off since then. So that's going back more years than I care to say, but Jim's looking good on it. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Jim is going to talk about the global migration trends in nursing, which is going to set the backdrop for us for the rest of the webinar. So Jim, thank you for being with us. You're very welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I won't say we're older and wiser, I'll say we're more mature and wiser than we were in those heady WHO days. As you say, I'm going to really kick us off by having a fairly quick, somewhat rapid run through an overview of data and trends related to nurse migration mobility across the globe. And in 20 minutes, I can only skate the surface, but what I will be looking at is beginning with brief consideration of overview and recent trends, flag up the issue of the impact of COVID-19 and how it certainly in the short term has disrupted travel. Then look at trends with COVID, although we're quite early in that process, and conclude with some of my own reflections on what I think are significant action points that need to be considered. So I'm going to start with 2 or 3 slides that are very quick summaries of the overview. And we're very fortunate that recently there have been several publications that help paint a backdrop. There's the State of the World's Nursing Report, which came out last year, which I'm referencing in this slide. And there's also a more recent report come out from OECD, and I've listed that in the list of references at the end of my PowerPoint. The only limitation in most of this information is that it predates COVID. It paints a reasonably detailed picture, but it is essentially painting the picture of the world before the pandemic. And it's very clear we're going to have to give a lot of consideration to the impact of COVID in terms of what that will mean as a driver for migration, as a constraint in some cases on mobility. So with that in your minds, I'm just, as I said, going to go through quite quickly a few slides to paint the backdrop. So this is from State of the World's Nursing, and really paints the picture around about the end of 2018-19. So global nursing workforce, 27.9 million. Estimated shortage of around about 5.96 million nurses, mainly concentrated in low and lower middle income countries, in areas where growth in numbers of nurses is barely keeping pace with population growth, as the report said. Very much the case that across the globe, 9 out of 10 nurses are female. And another very important factor to bear in mind, around about 17% of nurses anticipated to retire in the next 10 years. So that means that we need to find another 4.7 million nurses just to replace those who are retiring before we think about doing anything about the current shortages. So a shortage scenario, and then COVID exposed the risks of running with shortages. When we also look at the extent to which individual countries are able to or trying to meet their nursing requirements from their own education output, there is huge variation demonstrated by data from OECD. And this is important to think through if we're talking about international recruitment, active international recruitment, as a way of compensating for low numbers coming out of domestic nurse education. So the OECD data, some countries in the OECD are graduating 4 times as many nurse graduates as others. So in Australia, 82 nurse graduates per 100,000 population. In comparison, several countries there, which is a quarter of that level, 20, 21, Portugal 24, UK 27. So a very big variation in the extent to which countries are producing sufficient, or in some cases, arguably insufficient new nurses. Also to factor in that across the 36 high-income countries of OECD, something like 550,000 foreign-trained nurses are working. And that had increased by almost 100,000 since 10 years before. So we are seeing the phenomenon, which has always been there, of nurse mobility and migration, ramping up. More and more nurses working in countries other than those where they were initially trained. In terms of destination countries, the US has the highest number of foreign trained nurses, about 200,000, followed by the UK with about 100,000. And the point I made earlier about self-sufficiency, which would occur if a country didn't need to rely on international nurses coming in. No country is completely self-sufficient because we're all connected. But if you look at the extent of reliance on international nurses, this varies quite a lot. Within the OECD countries, New Zealand is highest with 26% of its nurses being foreign trained. But you can look elsewhere on the globe, countries in the Gulf, it's as high as 97%. So nearly all the nurses in some Gulf states are from other countries. And the OECD data has also shown that there are several lower middle income countries in Africa, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Kenya, which are the source, the origin of relatively large numbers of foreign trained nurses working across the OECD. Just a graphic there to show the point about big variations in extent of reliance on foreign trained nurses. So New Zealand there, about 27%, Australia around about 17, 18, but as you can see across the different countries, there are very big variations in levels of reliance on foreign trained nurses. And if we look at the immediate pre-COVID situation, these were the 9 countries estimated by OECD to have the highest proportion of their nurses working in other countries. So that percentage there is the percentage of nurses trained in that country that were now working in other countries. And what stands out when you look at that countries is 2 things. One is that many of the countries affected most are small island states. So they're potentially very vulnerable because they have small numbers to start with. And the second point to note is that with one exception, these are all countries where nurses are trained in English. So having a nursing qualification speaking English is a double whammy. It allows you to, if you wish, travel to many different countries. So that was the pre-COVID picture, but now we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and it's having several immediate impacts on nurse mobility, and I will argue will have even more fundamental impacts as we move forward. We have seen pent-up supply. We've read and seen of nurses who had already signed up to travel and work in another country, suddenly find that the travel was not there. They could not move. So there is a sense of pent-up supply, particularly being reported in the Philippines. So these nurses want to move, but for some reason related to COVID and travel constraints, weren't able to move. Secondly, we've seen an immediate negative impact on domestic nurse numbers and retention. This is playing through into absence, burnout, and I think we'll also see early retirement, deferred leave, volunteers who come to work for a period stepping back. And this is all going to generate in the short to mid-term an increased demand in countries for nurses. So we will see this pent up increased demand as part of the building back process in countries. And those who can afford it will and are already looking at ramping up international recruitment as a quick fix to fill vacancies and to counter the additional vacancies being created by COVID. And this inevitably plays into the broader issue around active international recruitment risking to increase even further current maldistribution across the globe. And some countries' COVID responses could be undermined if they see too many of their nurses leaving. We are in this process at the moment where there's not much data to demonstrate what I'm highlighting here, because there's always a few months before the data can catch up. But what I have got here is data, long-term data from the UK, just to illustrate partly the long-term cycle of nurse mobility, but also to pick up the immediate impact of COVID. So this graph shows the number of international nurses registering in the UK every year since 1990. The red part of the column are nurses from non-European Union countries. The blue part were nurses coming from European Union. You can see that it's ebbed and flowed very significantly across time. It peaked back in around about 2001, 2002, when there was very active international recruitment, dropped back, and has begun to pick up again. The impact of the Brexit vote in 2016 meant there was an immediate drop-off of nurses coming from the EU. And I only have data for the first 6 months of the last year, up to September, but what we can see there is a dramatic drop as COVID got in the way of travel and transport. And illustrating that even more precisely, this is data from the same source by month. COVID began impacting in March 2020, and in the month following that, virtually no new nurses from international sources were coming into the UK. So an immediate impact, immediate drop. But my argument is this is very short term, and we're already beginning to read and see a very rapid ramping up of nurses coming to the UK, particularly England, from other countries, as a result of active international recruitment. So I've got a couple of final slides to really begin to consider what action points need to be borne in mind against this backdrop where I'm arguing that we've seen a rapid drop in mobility because of COVID, but the underlying supply and demand factors are very clearly pointing to active international recruitment increasing and nurse mobility increasing as soon as any travel constraints are removed. And I've got two slides here. The first is to look at country action, and the second is more about international agencies action. And for both, I'm arguing we need to consider and frame responses within the WHO Code of Practice on international recruitment of health personnel. So what should countries be doing? Firstly, and this is still the case, some need to improve the data on the nursing workforce. If they're to understand how many they're recruiting from other countries, how many they're losing to other countries, there needs to be decent data. Secondly, and given the data I showed about the huge variation in domestic nurse education output, I think there's a very strong argument that some countries that can afford to train and educate more nurses should be doing so, if that's feasible. That will help in terms of meet their own demand and reduce the need to recruit from other countries. Looking also at improving retention of nurses. Again, the more we can retain nurses in the workforce, the less is the need to be looking at replacing them. This has to be voluntary retention. This has to be because the nurse wants to. We need to be looking at policies to enable nurses to work for longer if they wish to and maintain their engagement in the nursing as a career. We also, in many countries, need to look at a secondary linked factor in terms of retention, which is looking at stretching the career opportunities, looking particularly at opportunities in advanced practice and specialist roles. And finally, countries need to monitor and track the extent to which they are self-sufficient, whether they're moving towards self-sufficiency or away from self-sufficiency, because that will raise flags about what types of policies need to be considered. So just in terms of a final slide, this is more looking internationally at the issue. And I think international agencies need to commit to effective monitoring of international flows of nursing. We're getting better. The data is improving, but it's still incomplete for many countries. So we need to work collectively to improve the ability to monitor flows. We also need to do a lot more in terms of evaluating different approaches to manage international supply of nurses, which take both an effective and an ethical dimension to approaches. There's very little good evaluation or documented evidence about what works or doesn't work in this space. Thirdly, we need to place international mobility within the broader nursing labour market in countries and understand the extent to which international flows are significant, are a problem, or are not a problem. And we can only do that through having effective national labour market analysis and workforce projections. And final point, collectively, I think we need to commit to supporting and investing in nurse workforce sustainability in countries that are going to be particularly vulnerable to nurse outflow. I showed earlier that that's often small island states, but also fragile states and lower income states. They can all be damaged very significantly, very quickly, just by the loss of a few scarce nursing staff. So again, this is an issue to, I think, come back to in our discussion later this afternoon, but very much my own suggestions in terms of action points. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to debate and discussion. Thank you.
Jim, thanks so much. That was absolutely fascinating. So I was just thinking about monitoring, and I recall when we were both at WHO, one of the challenges we had was you could tell when somebody entered a country, but not when they left. Is that still the case, or has that got better?
There has been some improvement, but it's still generally the case, even demonstrated by the data I was using just now. It's mainly collected by OECD, and it's about who has arrived in OECD countries rather than who is leaving countries outside the OECD. So there is still this asymmetry in our levels of understanding about leaving or joining countries.
Right. It seems to me, like just from my perspective, that it seems like a real big picture issue, that what you really need is good labour market planning in all countries, which there didn't used to be. I mean, I'm hoping that with all the HRH, all the human resources for health publications and so on, and national workforce accounts, that's beginning to improve. Would that be true?
I think there's generally some progress. It's patchy, and you can see it being faster in some places than others. And I would not advocate we need perfect data before we make policy, because that way we will never get anywhere. But I think part of the process of improvement has to be a recognition that we need to improve our understanding of how many are moving and why. And at the root of that, we need to have good data.
Yeah. Yes, thanks so much. And that's one of the things that we have been stressing, in our season of advocacy to nurses who've joined us, is that they should be asking, where is the data?
Yeah.
And also understanding it and advocating for where you see shortages and, not enough people being recruited into the education system, into the pipeline. But you can't advocate unless you actually know the data, can you?
Yeah, and I think there's also need to be creative and look at where there may be data that is underutilized. So we need to be looking at professional council data, nursing association data, data from migration departments, rather than just always relying on ministries of health. We need to be quite creative, look broadly.
Yeah, good point, Jim. And I see questions are coming in, so we'll crack on, and we'll have some more questions at the end, Jim. Thank you again so much. That was a wonderful background.
Thanks,
and
Barbara.
Now we're going from Scotland to Canada, and I'm introducing to you Margaret Walton Roberts, whom I have been chatting to recently. And Margaret is actually a geographer. So I think, Margaret, you're the first geographer we've ever had on our webinar series, and you are so welcome. Margaret's at the Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. And Margaret, I think it's true to say you've been looking at migration slightly differently as sort of the future of work and how can we address some of these issues. So we're delighted to have you. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. I'm very pleased to be with you all. So thank you for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen and I hope that you can see it. Okay. Okay, are you seeing my slides?
Yes, I can see them, Margaret. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you so much again for the invitation. I'm happy to talk about some of the research that I've done in terms of the migration dimension of the discussion that we're having. And part of this discussion is about migration and the future of healthcare work, especially the idea of how to build back better. Hang on, sorry, I'm just having some issues with the screen. I just need to. Okay. Okay.
You're trying to make it full screen?
Yeah, it's not moving, sorry.
No, I know, it's a pickle, isn't it? That.
Let me try again.
Okay.
It's worked, of course, earlier, but now it's not. Okay. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. There we
Oh,
go.
we've got the outline though, and what? There we go. That's it. You've got it.
Thank you. So sorry. So yes, let me speed through some of this because there's a lot of issues, and Jim did a wonderful presentation that gives us a really good overview from the outset. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of these bigger issues, thinking about how to build back better, but also thinking about the future of healthcare work, thinking about various elements linked to this in terms of human-robot interaction, automation, and so on, thinking about migrant healthcare labor, but positioning it within wider workplace changes and challenges. So just I'll quickly overview some of those issues, thinking about the impact of COVID-19, really building on the excellent presentation that Jim provided. And then finally, again, really kind of reasserting many of the arguments that Jim made in terms of building back better. But positioning the analysis in terms of health worker migration within some of the larger big picture discussions about the future of healthcare work, particularly things like human robot interaction. So as we know, many of the arguments within this field talk about humans at the heart of healthcare. And so much of the literature that has examined the role of sort of robots within healthcare has argued that technical solutions really have to integrate social and ethical issues. This means humans really should remain at the heart of production developments, with machinery, including robotics, used as supportive or assistive systems. And so what this tells us is that despite sometimes the scaremongering that is associated with the idea of automation and robotics, that none of this will happen without human interaction, that humans are still vital to whatever is going on. And so even when you look at the robots used in, say, lift assist, these things won't happen without human intervention, overview, supervision. What we're looking at really is thinking about task shifting and not replacement of workers. So even if many of these kind of new futures in terms of how the future of work come to be, we still require human workers, especially in the domain of healthcare. And so what we see, however, is that care robots really open up these new technologically facilitated global care change. So they kind of further globalize care at the local level. And so this is important when we think about the issues that Jim discussed in terms of the way in which labor markets are kind of constituted through both domestically trained but also internationally trained nurses. And so you have this kind of amalgam of different work groups coming together within these newly articulated workplaces that will kind of come to be. Thinking about automation and artificial intelligence, this is also having an impact on how healthcare systems work. I'm sorry if this chart is so small. I sort of try to shove everything on my slides, but what this slide is basically indicating, and this is looking at the percentage change in employment shares of Canadian workers between 1987 and 2018, is that many of the occupations where we have seen growth are in professional occupations in nursing, occupations in health, technical occupations in health, occupations in law and social and community support, and occupations in support of health services. And so really this reasserts the calls that have come from the World Health Organization, the ILO, Nursing Now and other groups for the importance of investing in nursing in the future, not just in terms of the health, but also generally in the economy and in the labor market. So regardless of what happens in terms of automation, these particular kinds of jobs remain important. And in terms of artificial intelligence, this is really where we see some of these developments in terms of technology and how it might affect the healthcare sector. So this was an interesting story that I was looking at in terms of a Boston company called IntelliCare. It's a Boston staffing agency. They're present in 20 states across the US. They ended 2020 as one of the fastest growing companies in Massachusetts and the USA. What this company uses is advanced algorithms in combination with gig economics to strategically allocate staffing resources. And they argue that they allow nurses to control their own schedules, and demand for their services has increased about 106% between 2019 and 2020. And so, as we know, with regards to nursing, often scheduling and shift planning and, agency nursing and so on is an enormous complexity within the workplace. And so these kinds of AI algorithm, gig economy companies are really interesting to analyze in terms of the impact they might have in both, negative and positive. And so we'll talk a little more about this especially. Also, it's important to understand the idea of the technology and restructuring the professions. So some of you may have seen the work by Richard and Daniel Susskind, The Future of the Professions. And their argument is interesting, applying to all professional groups, but they really do indicate that, say, teleprofessionalism is sort of unrestrained by geography. And so we've seen a lot of that happen during COVID-19. And what they suggest is you get this sort of disintermediated relationship between kind of clients and professionals. And they suggest that as this increases, there'll be a lot of opportunities for what they call paraprofessionals to sort of re-intermediate interaction between the professions and the clients who seek their services. And so there's other kind of areas in terms of thinking about the empathetic assistance. And we see this, for example, some of you are familiar with the kind of nurse navigators for cancer patients who kind of really re-intermediate the relationship between the patient and some of other health professional groups. And so there's all kinds of new opportunities here. And so they talk about surgeons who can decompose their work, bring in the paraprofessionals to provide that empathy and face-to-face guidance. And there's interesting research on medical tourism that provides a lot of rich detail on this issue of intermediation. There's also the work by Mark Britnell, who's done an interesting analysis and looking a big overview about solving the global workforce crisis. And he really pushes for AI to help stimulate disruptive digital possibilities and increase time for care and to boost productivity. And he argues that healthcare systems have to become learning systems, they have to educate, re-educate, and support staff, etc. There's also an analysis that needs to be done in terms of how migrant healthcare workers fit into this. And I would argue that what we're seeing with the role of migrant healthcare workers is that they're part of a larger change that's occurring in terms of the workplace. We are seeing deteriorating and more precarious working conditions. So this happens both in terms of driving migration, because we have increased patient workloads, long working hours, poor infrastructure, budget constraints, etc. So we know this is happening in many of the contexts that end up sending migrant workers, but there's also a similar process in terms of the context in receiving countries. And this is where, again, the kind of retention issue, the outflow of workers, that there needs to be supplemented by this kind of quick fix of bringing in migrant workers. So, for example, in the US, there's been the analysis of how health workers focus or face what's called moral injury, as they really try to make socially inequitable healthcare systems deliver care for the diverse population groups that they have a duty to care for. As Jim mentioned, during COVID-19, what we've been seeing is outflows of nurses. Certainly in Quebec, this has been seen as evident. We've had nurses leaving their jobs. We've had nurses quit. We've had a number of nurses be on sick leave. And so we're really seeing this system be stressed and kind of buckle under that strain. As I mentioned before, there's also subcontracting and agency work. And in some cases, however, nurses choose agency work for a variety of reasons. This could be shift flexibility, avoidance of stressful responsibilities. This has been identified in the UK as well as in the Canadian case. And so again, that speaks something about the nature of the work and how people cope. They cope by removing themselves in terms of their responsibility long term to particular workplaces, engaging in agency work. In terms of looking at where nurses are working, there are these expanding places of work. So in Canada, about half of regulated healthcare workers are in hospital settings. Nurse practitioners in Canada tend to work more in community care. This is as their autonomous and broader scope of practice. What we are going to witness as we experience our aging societies is a change in the nature, sites, and the skill mix of those involved in this care. And so here, my analysis in Canada, primarily in Ontario, has really focused on the incorporation of personal support workers, or PSWs. These are unregulated care workers, often working in combination with other health and work teams. They tend to increasingly be providing care to more and more complex cases in long-term care facilities. And so this is another changing nature of the workplace as the aging societies deal with care provision. And in Canada, long-term care facilities are not included under the Canadian Health Act. And so they're kind of seen as outside of that, which is problematic and leads to siloing in terms of the nature of healthcare. Personal support workers are also really important in all of these new places of work that are focused on care for the elderly, disabled, and so on. And so I'll talk a bit more about personal support workers in a moment. There's also the issue of globalization of health more generally. And so this is another feature of that kind of workplace changes. We are seeing the back process officing work in healthcare. For example, we've seen this arise in the Philippines and in India, as you have insurance companies, health transcription companies, and so on, outsourcing work to these BPO offices. And the health industry generally is about keeping profits up. And so we've been seeing the link between the need for profits and the attack on wages and working conditions. And so this is another one of those factors that leads to a sort of deterioration generally in kind of workplace conditions. And also the rise of private long-term care facilities. In Ontario, 59% of the healthcare facilities are privately run. And this has raised lots of concerns. Just, I also want to talk about segmentation and inequality as another feature of changing workplace conditions. Medscape's 2020 report on female physician compensation, for example, indicated that men consistently received greater compensation than women across all racial groups and across all kind of specialities. So there's certainly a very strong gendered inequality there. Also thinking about the nature of the workplace, when we look at segmentation between healthcare cadres, and here what I've done is I've brought together both the regulated and the unregulated, because there is increasing specialization, but there's also differentiation and segmentation occurring that we need to pay attention to. This is really important in Canada in terms of healthcare workers, because often internationally educated nurses come into Canada and they may end up working in this unregulated sector because their credentials aren't recognized, or because while they're waiting for their credentials to be evaluated, they have to find work in other sectors. So many end up working as personal support workers, unregulated care assistants. And so this is data from Ontario. And so the top chart shows the generally all of the numbers of, I've got nurse practitioners in blue, I've got registered nurses in orange, and the licensed practical nurses in gray, and then the PSWs are in yellow. And I brought them together because typically these groups do work together. And across Ontario, you get the kind of classic hourglass. You have large numbers of registered nurses, less licensed practical nurses, and large numbers of personal support workers. But when you look at immigrants, where immigrants are registered within, where they are positioned within the health occupations in Ontario, what you see there is much more of a pyramid, much larger numbers of immigrants working as PSWs, with less and less working as you move into the LPNs and the registered nurses and the nurse practitioners. And so there's a different role here in terms of how the labour market is segmented and how immigrants are kind of slotted into the workplace. And I brought the personal support workers into this analysis because I think it's important when we think about interprofessional collaboration, especially a lot of work that's been done in the long-term care facilities has argued that we need to transcend this negative stratification that occurs, need to build cohesion, interprofessional teamwork in a supportive environment. And so there's, and this interprofessional collaboration is really important. And a recent report from the Canadian Nurses Association has been exploring that in some detail. I'll quickly go over this because I think Jim did a really good job revealing many of the challenges that were faced. We've seen a number of documents that have indicated the stress and strains caused by COVID. We've seen reports coming from the Registered Practical Nurses Association in Ontario that are indicating fully the mental health stress, the lack of support that has been experienced, and also the International Council of Nurses report, which suggested we've seen a kind of a global phenomena of mass trauma that's been experienced by nurses. And we've seen the rates of infection and mortality, and still a lot of data collection needs to occur here, a lot of analysis, seen burnout, mental health, distress, isolation, inadequate PPE, violence, discrimination, and so on. And this, again, another element that we have seen be highlighted by COVID-19 is a realization, as Jim said, of the number of migrants who comprise healthcare workforces. There's important work here from the OECD that Jim also went through. But what's happened as well is that during COVID-19, OECD countries have really recognized the significance of their migrant healthcare workers. They've seen them as key assets. They introduced policies to help their arrival and recognize their qualifications in some cases. And so certainly this has highlighted what's already evident and clear. And this is something important, I think, that we need to kind of grasp onto and move forward. And there's been a number of interesting policies that have accelerated efforts to integrate migrant workers into the health system. In terms of deployment, there have been some responses by sending countries. The Philippines had a deployment ban. India has various sort of immigration restrictions that have been already in the pipeline. But the point has been made that if sending states really want to address the out-migration of their healthcare workers, they need to improve the conditions of work. They really need to focus on investing in the sector, enhancing retention. In terms of system responses, there are some positive outcomes. In Ontario, we've seen the provincial government recognise the significance of the personal support workers and increase wages. We've also seen, this is from the UK, an increase in the nursing enrolment as a reaction to the COVID-19 kind of event, that there's been a sort of recalibration of the importance of nursing and attraction to that profession. And also we've seen in Canada a really massive increase in enrollments in nursing programs. And so this was as this is incoming students fall of 2021 in Ontario programs. And you can just see there this massive increase in enrollment in nursing programs. And so this is kind of good news for highlighting the significance of the professional sector. So just quickly, in terms of building back better, again, many similar arguments that Jim made. COVID-19 has reinforced the significance of the work of the WHO, their high-level commission on health, employment and economic growth. We need to support the work of that international platform on health worker mobility to facilitate robust policy dialogue and action on health labour mobility, strengthen the code and relevant ILO conventions and recommendations. We need to, again, revisit and reinforce ethical recruitment models, health solidarity. There are several initiatives that states can examine in order to become better partners in global health and gender justice. And of course, the State of the World's Nursing Report highlights, again, many of these points: investment in education, continuous training, better data systems, ethically managed migration, promote interprofessional teams, and maximize competencies, engage in healthcare, and so on. So just to conclude, healthcare is subject to technological change, but the results are really about task shifting rather than displacement. We've got increased use of migrant health workers. It's part of wider system changes. These reflect various transformations in working conditions. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed and intensified these challenges, but we've seen some positive changes, and we need to build back better. We need to connect the dots between national and international labour supply, review the nature of international occupational segmentation, enhance fair migration, access to professions, career laddering, decent work agendas, and again, reinforcing much of what Jim suggested. So thank you, and I hope that we get to discuss this.
Margaret, thank you so much. You really broadened this discussion. It's fascinating to think about the future of work and the role of AI. And somebody posted in the chat box, Liz Madigan. No, it was, oh, it wasn't Liz. It was somebody else posted. Maybe we should start to think about the word nurse. Maybe it should be, we should have a better definition. And it made me recall that in State of the World's Nursing, I think there's something like 140 different ways in which the word nurse, the title nurse, is used. So when you begin to look at personal service workers and, the hourglass and the pyramid, it does make you understand that we're dealing in a very uncertain for what people stay if they are, as it were, underemployed. So if they're put into a personal service worker position, do they give up and go home, or do they stay?
No, the work as a personal support worker is often those who are interviewed, they say they see it as very rewarding and important work. And so that has been fairly consistent in research done on those who work as personal support workers. In some cases, I mean, we've done research with internationally educated nurses who end up working as personal support workers, and there's other dimensions to their life that make their quality of life better. And so they are happy to still be working in the health sector. But in some cases, it's a temporary engagement as a personal support worker while their documentation gets approved. And so it's very complex. And so this is the kind of issue about how pathways into practice. There are many kind of entangled and laddered ways in which immigrant educated nurses end up in various aspects of the health sector. And so this is a complexity that I think has to be more deeply engaged with, and we need to recognize that significance. So yes, in some cases, workers do stay. Sometimes it's just a stopgap, and in some ways they get exposure to that kind of Canadian healthcare system, and so it can have benefits for everyone involved, but it's still, it's unresolved. We're not sure fully.
Yes, you're right. It's incredibly complex migration, and I'm really glad this afternoon we're sort of uncovering some of the complexities, because it does show that we as nurses need to be on top of what's happening, to facilitate the people who can practice as nurses actually doing so. So thank you so much for that, Margaret. We're going to go now from Canada to Trinidad and Tobago, and Iddy Stewart. Hi, Iddy. Iddy and I last met in person in the Bahamas, which seems like a distant dream. Trinidad and Tobago, both imports and exports workers, Iddy. Can you talk to us a bit? Iddy's president of the National Nurses Association of Trinidad and Tobago, so very well versed in these issues. Can you give us an insight, Iddy? What's it like?
Yes, well, let me just run through it quickly. I would probably just want to use my slides quickly there. So I'm indeed pleased to contribute to this discussion by giving a brief perspective of the Trinidad and Tobago experience in nurse migration from the unique context of this southernmost Caribbean island, which found itself on page 25 of the report by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global Health, the Triple Impact Report. It spoke about the international migration of nurses to countries offering better opportunities. It disadvantages the poorest countries, something we all know, but it also pointed to an anomaly and an absurdity to some extent, where in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we are hemorrhaging local nurses as they leave for opportunities in the US and the UK, while the government of Trinidad and Tobago in turn recruits nurses from the Philippines, Cuba, and other islands within the Caribbean to fill this deficit. So as a receiver in nurse migration, recent global and regional agreements supporting the free movement of professional enhance these trends. Nursing holding Caribbean community CARICOM license can freely move between member countries. TNT recruits heavily from Cuba and Philippines via government-to-government arrangements in the public sector, really. And in the private sector, they have a tendency to recruit a number of Indian nurses to the private sector. So through these government-to-government arrangements, the nurses start off with the same basic salary. However, they are given a $3,000 TT housing allowance, which converts to about 316 UK pounds or 439 US dollars, which is not afforded to the local nurses. Understandably, this is a bone of contention for the local nurses. The nurses from the Philippines and India, you really use it as a stepping stone to until they reach to more developed countries like the US and whatnot, whereas the Cuban nurses have a tendency to remain after their contract of employment. As a sending nation in nurse migration, a quick snapshot through the years would see that while there was a tendency to have a 2-year bonding after graduation, many nurses left Trinidad and Tobago shores after graduation. Between the 60s and 70s, almost 60% had already immigrated, and the bulk going to the US. This continued in the main, even except for a slight fall in the 80s due to the global economic recession, which decreased the chances of nurses finding work abroad. When one analyzes the major push and pull factors according to ICN, International Center on Nurse Migration, the factors are basically the same. Trinidad and Tobago basically checks all the boxes that are on that list. And I'll just touch quickly on three main areas why nurses leave. Income is one of the main areas. The starting salary for a nurse in TNT is 7,507 TT, which works out to about 790 pounds or 1,100 US dollars. It must be noted that in TNT is recognized as a high income economy by the World Bank, largely driven by our natural gas and petrochemical sector. Unlike the other Caribbean countries, which are really based on tourism for the most part. So TNT has a very high cost of living, making it extremely difficult for nurses to even afford a middle-class lifestyle. When you watch the housing sector, for instance, an average low to middle income house is about 1.35 million TT, which works up to about 142,000 pounds or 197,000 US. Therefore, even two nurses, husband and wife, would find it very difficult to afford a house on the open market. Even when you watch the inflation rate, a 10-year inflation rate, we have been hovering over the last 10 years from a high of 12% in 2012 to 9% in 2015, and we're covering, because of the economic slowdown, around 1%. So we have really had high inflationary periods, unlike the UK and the US. Basically, they hover around 6 to 4%. They generally don't go above that. So even with that, nominal income is affected definitely by inflation. Job satisfaction is another worrying concern. There was a recent study done by Professor Onawa from the University of West Indies, which showed that the levels of motivation are extremely low amongst nursing personnel within Trinidad and Tobago. And the final area, one of the main areas for disenchantment, is the organizational environment in terms of educational opportunities and upward mobility of the ladder. That has really been a serious bone of contention, where the bulk of our postgraduate courses are really put on by the Ministry of Health. So all our dialysis, midwifery, pediatric, intensive care programs are already put on by the Ministry of Health. And it's really, those programs are not really accredited by our accreditation council of Trinidad and Tobago. They lack physical infrastructure. They generally rent facilities. So that standard is really a disincentive for nursing personnel. Yeah. The government have tried to stem the flow over the years, particularly in the 90s when there was really mass migration. And they tried two basic areas, tried to reinforce that bonding. They carried it up to a 3-year bonding of all nurses who would have graduated. And then they also tried to give an incentive in terms of salary, in terms of providing a 25% incentive to encourage nurses to stay. Unfortunately, that had some effect, but that effect over the years has really diminished severely, and nurses have returned to their migration. So the stemming of the flow really has not borne fruit as the government would have first thought. There's very little return migration. Nurses who would have gotten that experience. Very few come back to Trinidad and Tobago, despite several attempts from the state to encourage oncology and pediatric nurses and ICU especially to return home. But because that they will be returning home basically at a starting salary of a nurse, that is totally unacceptable for the bulk of nurses. So they generally don't return home. They only return home basically for managerial positions if they open up, or to retire after their terms of employment. Yeah. I was watching the presentation done yesterday by some of our colleagues, ILO and some persons on this webinar today. and they spoke about the resilience, recruitment, and retention, and Trinidad and Tobago, from the association point of view, very rarely does anything but recruit. We really don't focus on any of the other aspects in terms of retention, redeployment. None of those other aspects we really focus on generally. So that is a serious area we could focus on going forward. So what's the way forward for the Nursing Association? We have basically mapped out a 4-pronged strategy to address some of these areas of concern. We focus on becoming the recognized union for nursing and midwifery personnel, so we could start bargaining on our own behalf, coming out of that whole public service sector negotiation, and really trying to address some of our shortfalls within our profession. So that's one of our main goals. 2, unfortunately, with that goal, it appears that we would become the majority union for nurses and midwives to represent on their behalf. 2, following on the Nursing Now campaign, we are seeking to get more nursing personnel into policy-making positions, moving out of the standard nursing leadership positions, but more into non-traditional health administrative positions to really influence policy-making, and also to focus on directing our policy initiatives at various ministers, not only the Minister of Health, but various other ministries. And thirdly, we focused on getting the ILO Nursing Personnel Convention 149 ratified within Trinidad and Tobago. And coming with that, it would lead to an improvement of some of the shortfalls we would have highlighted above. Additionally, once that ILO Nursing Personnel Convention, which the government has agreed to ratify, and it should be done by early next year, and we thank the government for doing that, it will also lend into affecting a number of the other legislation that affect nursing and midwifery personnel. So in my brief, short period, I thank you for affording me the opportunity to present here today, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Iddy, thank you so much. That was really highlighting, I think, all the things Nursing Now has been standing for the last 3 years. You know, you've made it very real. This is the lived experience in Trinidad and Tobago, that nurses are out there doing the hard work, but often not valued for the work they do, not adequately rewarded, and not with the terms, conditions that they should have. And ILO has been extremely slow in getting the new nursing convention out.
Yes.
But we do have an opportunity, don't we, coming up with the World Health Assembly. Are you going to go? Will you be there? Oh, well, it's virtual, isn't it? Are you invited?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, and we have signed up, definitely.
Good. Because, yes, it's an opportunity for nurses to have their say through the country delegations, but also through our next speaker. Thank you, Iddy. And I'm going to go from Trinidad and Tobago to Geneva now in Switzerland, where Howard is waiting. Hi, Howard. And you've just come at this wonderful moment when we're talking about what can we do? What can we do about all of this? What's the sort of global response to migration of nurses? And if we're such popular global workforce, why don't we get the transfer fees that soccer players get? So, Howard, over to you.
Hi, Barbara. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you. I should have learnt by now, shouldn't I, that, you know, if you come at the end of a webinar where Barbara, Jim, Margaret and Iddy have spoken, you know, there's not an awful lot left to say. So the short version could be, I agree with Barbara, Jim, Margaret and Iddy, but I suspect Barbara deliberately, knowing Barbara, may even be goading me in to try and give a perspective or an angle on this that that might be a little bit different. So let me see what I can do, Barbara. I haven't got a presentation. The 3 documents, I think some of these have been referenced already, but just for colleagues to know that I would rely on, or I would commend to you. ICN has an international career mobility and ethical nurse recruitment position statement freely available on our website. So have a look at our position statement. Jim and I worked on a report we published in September last year called COVID-19 in the International Supply of Nurses, again available on our website. So look at that. A number of colleagues, of course, have mentioned State of the World's nursing. The great Carrie McCarthy, who I see is on the webinar, the powerhouse behind that. So those are the three documents that I'd encourage people to look at. But my opener, firstly, Barbara, I think is in relation to the scale of the global shortage. State of the World's Nursing, we said 6 million. Work that we've done at ICN with Jim and looking at aging and using some of the State of the World's Nursing data tells us there are about 4 million nurses who are eligible to retire over the next few years. So that takes it up to 10 million. ICN has been running a commentary on the impact of COVID on the global nursing workforce. Margaret, thank you for mentioning some of those reports on mental health, but we've looked at issues around higher leaver rates as well. We've looked at issues around PPE, infection rates and things as well. There is undoubtedly, in our view, a COVID effect on the global nursing workforce. And if that translates into more nurses leaving the profession than otherwise would have done earlier, by a couple of million, that could push us to 12, 13 million nurses, about half the global nursing workforce who we may need to replace over the next few years. The world has changed hugely in the last 18 months. And I would put a really big caution over our assumptions, our data, what we thought the world looked like 2016 to 2019, when a lot of these reports that we refer to were first published, and what it looks like now. I actually think, just from a policy point of view, from a data point of view, we've just had the State of the World's Nursing. I think that we absolutely need some interim report on the state of the world's nursing, perhaps not the next State of the World's Nursing report, but a report of, we could do this again, WHO and ICN in a couple of years' time, to really understand what the impact of the pandemic has been on the global nursing workforce. This, though, I think is not unreasonable, that the mismatch between supply and demand, nursing supply and healthcare demands, has widened even further over the course of the last 2 years, and is set to again because of all the non-COVID health needs that we know are building up and growing. And this divide, this mismatch, comes on top of what we already know, the gross inequalities of the distribution of the nursing workforce, 89% in low middle income countries where shortages are, 3-4-fold differences in the graduation rates per 100,000 population of different countries as well. Barbara, this made me think a little bit, you know, that we've been talking so much about and doing a lot of work rightfully in relation to vaccine inequity and how that's challenging the world at the moment. You know, I was even thinking, is this we're critical of vaccine nationalism. Might we be seeing a form of nursing nationalism in terms of how those countries with shortages are approaching how they will address those shortages, in the same way that we've seen wealthy countries who could afford to mass order many, many more vaccines than they needed to control the market, to control the supply, and the impact that that has, 3.3% of vaccines, COVID vaccines, have gone into the arm of all that have been administered, only 0.3% have gone into the arms of people in Africa. Is this similar in a way? Is that inequity, similar? And it is, but it isn't. And there is one really big important difference, that what those countries who are recruiting from other countries are doing, yes, they're taking a resource, but they are taking a resource that country has paid for, has paid to educate, has already made an investment. They're not taking a free a free good. So perhaps I'm being a little bit controversial, Barbara, but just framing it framing this in a slightly different way. What therefore can we do? What can we do? So, could talk all day about it's a challenging situation. What can we do? And from ICN, we do have some really practical thoughts on what we could do. A number of colleagues have talked about mentioned the webinar we held with the International Labour Organization yesterday. And one of the issues we talked about was this concept that ICN have of hero funds. Let me just explain. I've said that there's massive global nursing shortages. Is it 6 million? Is it 12 million? Debate. But at the same time, the number of jobs lost globally, ILO estimate over the course of the pandemic, 255 million, and possibly more to come this year as well. People in retail, hospitality, transport, we know who've lost their jobs. There is a solution here under our nose, is there not? That we could provide employment to people who lost jobs in some sectors, to address nursing workforce and to invest in workforce would need funding. Of course it would need funding. It would need support. But it's not magic. I think it's something that obviously we could look at. And our ILO webinar yesterday, we had a range of nursing perspectives and employment experts who all were broadly supportive of doing that as well. So there's one potential solution. Do you know the other thing as well, Barbara, that I think that we talk about data and we need more, and I agree with all of that. But I also sometimes think that where is the simple data on this? If I want to know how reliant a country is on overseas recruitment compared to being self-sufficient, what metric tells me that? The report Jim and I worked on, in that report, we said, why don't we have a self-sufficiency indicator? Very, very simple. It's the number of nurses who have been born or educated overseas as a proportion of your total nursing workforce. Let's see. I mean, it's a self-sufficient. Are you 20-25% reliant on nurses overseas, or are you only 5%? I think that sort of metrics are important, but also let's make them simple and let's think about the ones that don't exist. So there's a couple of solutions. And the third area that I really wanted to highlight, Barbara, tomorrow we are releasing the latest in our series of briefings on the COVID effect on nursing, and we're concentrating specifically this time round on education and on pay issues, but we are highlighting that from a most recent survey of our associations, 30% of our associations say that they can see evidence of a renewed interest in the nursing profession in their countries. And some colleagues have already mentioned, I think, the UK and Denmark, where there's hard data in terms of the increase in the number of applications. Let me put it like this, Barbara. Is it really right, given the pictures that we're seeing coming out of India and the Philippines right now, that we are trying to facilitate, support, ease recruitment from those two countries, which we know have historically been suppliers of nurses to the world, at the same time that some of the countries who are looking at recruiting have people in their own country who want to train and be educated to be nurses? If there is that interest in your country, provide the places, support the faculty, look at using technology for more innovative educational provision to be able to educate more nurses. It requires investment. Again. So I honestly, I think that there are some solutions. There are some solutions there, but they require some political will to follow through as well. Do keep an eye out for the report. As I said, our next report tomorrow, which will unpick a bit of that some more, because from the pay issue, whilst I've said that we're seeing evidence from some countries of an interest in coming into nursing, what we're also seeing is increasing discontent, strikes and disputes in other countries who have failed to provide PPE, protection and support for nurses. The pandemic may drive nurses into the profession in some places, but in other places, I fear it could be driving them out. Final couple of thoughts, Barbara. I think it's just important to reference regulators and employers. They have big roles to play. Of course, the regulator is hugely important in terms of setting standards of entry and whether they can, what they put in place. Is it a facilitator or is it a slower or a blocker to people migrating? This is a question that I'm playing out in my own mind and with colleagues at ICN at the moment as well. There are some very strong reasons for harmonization of regulation between countries around the world in terms of, making sure that people who, somebody in a country who may have done something very unpleasant or criminal doesn't easily find themselves into a workforce in another country. So regulators should be talking to each other. But how far do you harmonize regulation? And if we're seeing harmonization of regulation policies now, as a consequence, will that speed and ease international migration, and might there be unintended consequences there? So I think there are some big issues around the role of regulators, and let's never forget how important employers are in all of this. Those employers who do this well, who do induction, who do support, who help people to take out bank accounts, who make sure that there's equal work for equal value, there's non-discrimination at work. They're not afraid to tell people that there is a grievance process. They're not afraid to say there is a national nursing association that you should join. Let's applaud those employers and promote that good employment practice, but equally need to call out, monitor, and have regulations in place to deal with poor employment practice. Final point then, Barbara, is in terms of what can we do internationally. Big opportunities with Year of the Health and Care Worker, big opportunities with the new strategy for nursing and midwifery, which is coming down the pipes very soon as well. But my overall reflection is that I fear that the international regulations at the moment are too weak. I think that and I'm not saying they've been deliberately designed like that. I think that they were designed pre-COVID. And I think COVID and all of the things that everybody else has spoken about is changing the dynamics significantly. And I think the sort of metrics and international codes and regulations which have teeth, and I think which consider that tricky issue of how you compensate countries as well. Whilst people may have wanted to push them away in the past, I'm not sure that we can so easily now because of the COVID experience. And what we should absolutely see, final point, Barbara, world leaders talking about we're going to have a post-pandemic treaty they're all going to sign up to. Brilliant. Yes, we absolutely need one. Nursing healthcare workforce should be written boldly across the face and right through the heart of that treaty. If it is nice words that doesn't start to talk about some of the actions countries could commit to on nursing in the health workforce, it will be, I fear, a paper tiger. But I don't want it to be like that. I want it to be a treaty that roars and bites. Back to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Howard. Is that treaty actually going ahead?
I read the same reports as you. I think WHO had proposed it. There are about 20 countries who've said, yeah, they think it's a good thing. I think that the meeting that is going to be happening in your neck of the woods or down in Cornwall with the G7 is quite important as well. So it seems as though there is a direction. But Jim and others might know more than me. Can I
ask the rest of the panel to show yourselves, please? I think we have time for a quick discussion. Hi, welcome back. So I just wanted to thank you all so much. I mean, you've raised amazing points, and I think we could really go on discussing this for some time. I wanted to raise a point that's actually been put in the Q&A box, and it was specifically about China, but what it speaks to is this situation that I think we still find where there are people migrating. There are a shortage of staff in the sending country, as it were, the losing country, but there's also unemployment. And I just wondered, is that a trend we still find? To me, that speaks about the conditions of retention and recruitment in the workforce. Any comments on that? How do you deal with that? Who should we be lobbying? Margaret.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. That's evident also in the Philippines, I think. There's clearly an oversupply of nurses. It's almost a policy decision, but it's also, and this speaks a bit to some of Howard's comments about the argument about poaching and brain drain, and of course that's evident, but I think we have to be aware of the way in which some of these major supplying countries, particularly India and the Philippines, have kind of oriented themselves toward oversupply of nurses alongside the lack of investment in their own healthcare sectors. So they're almost generating a system that is going to be structurally oriented to outmigration. And in both India and Philippines, a lot of the nursing education is now private. They're private colleges. It's not necessarily funded by the state. And so the debt that is incurred tends to be retained by the household, by the individual. And so there is still an ethical concern there in terms of the kind of global imbalance and who's bearing the costs, who's bearing the benefits. But there's a complexity to this system that is making it self-sustaining. And so I think that the issue in China is similar in some ways to Philippines and India in terms of there being an oversupply of nurses, primarily through private educational and training institutions. And because of the lack of investment within the domestic health system, those nurses are not absorbed because the conditions of work are not favorable, especially when you're carrying a large debt from your private education. And so in some ways you're obliged to engage in the global migration circuit. And so I think that's a systemic thing that is going to also be important to consider.
Yeah, so much of this is systemic, isn't it? I mean, it's about the big picture, usually, not just about one thing. Anybody else want to comment on that? Jim?
Yeah, just to build on what Margaret said, I think we have to recognize that, particularly Philippines and India, the growth in nurse education there has been driven by international recruitment, and it's done in the private sector. It's paid for by the nurses. I think something like 95% of nursing schools producing BSc nurses in India are in the private sector. So there are issues there about this not being the result of any planning, any projections, any consideration for domestic labour markets. It's essentially a parallel system, which is really only oriented out of the country. And you then can have this situation where there's also underemployment or unemployment in the country of nurses because resource allocation decisions made by governments, as Howard has pointed out, are not in favour of nurses. I agree with Howard that COVID has, in many senses, been a game changer, but I think some of these underlying dynamics will continue because it's about governments taking responsibility or not for planning and resource allocation in terms of nurse education and nurse employment.
So we have another question in the box, which is about whether WHO should review its ethical approval for international recruitment, given all the lost employment and as you say, COVID's changed the picture. But I want to broaden that question a bit. I want to make it a bit more provocative, really. Do you think that there should be a sort of international fund that would help countries recruit nurses temporarily where they were most needed? So it would be a bit like Gavi or the Global Fund or COVAX, but it would be invested in, could say, health workforce. But I'm being a bit deliberately provocative here. Going beyond the sort of ethics of international recruitment, which I'm sure all of us see in a very similar way. But, should we start thinking very differently about recruitment and retention, particularly of nurses, given what Howard has said about this crippling shortage, which the world may well be facing? Anybody want to have a crack? Jim?
Firstly, I've got to declare an interest. I was on the panel that reviewed the WHO code a couple of years ago, so I obviously think it's a good idea, but I think it needs to be built on, and it's a voluntary instrument. What it really requires is for governments to action it and work with it and work with civil society and nursing associations in countries. So I think it has potential that is still underutilized. I think the more broad provocative question you're raising there, I think is it's one of those ones which in principle, I immediately think, yes, that's a fantastic idea. And then I begin to think about the practicalities and what's the best use of your money. I would advocate funding more public sector education in countries that need nurses, linked to effectively managed return of service contracts. So you train the nurse for free, and then she commits to working, or he commits to working for 3 years in the country. I think in terms of developing capacity within the countries that need it most, admittedly, that's a kind of midterm solution. And the idea of a transferable pool of nurses could be a short-term solution. And given the particular situation we are in now with COVID, I think it makes sense at initial analysis.
Well, that's a good point, Jim. And yeah, I appreciate that. I think investing in the return and education of nurses would be very wise. And education's cropped up quite a bit in our chat. We'll go to that in a moment. But Howard, you want to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts, because I think in terms of an international fund, then the ILO, WHO, OECD sort of have started to do that with the Working for Health initiative. So I think there's the bones of something. There is the bones of something there, but I think it's bigger about trying to bring in public and private funding to support education and scaling up. And I think it can work at that level, but I have a caution like Jim about an over reliance on, Jim said that, I support the global code. I remember working on that, years ago when I was at the college. It's right, and it has its place, but it's voluntary, and it will always get caught between countries who are in different places, who either want a tightening or an easing of any global restrictions, dependent on what their context and their perspective is. The ILO convention we heard yesterday, there's only 42 countries who are signed, who are signed up to that, this is dreadful. I'd like to see a little bit more light in terms of data and metrics to, why are there only 42 countries that are signed up? Let's have, the Self-Sufficiency Indicator. Let's see how countries are doing, because I think what the international debate dialogue can really then very helpfully do is to drive conversations, to drive the dialogue about what's happening, what's going on, and this is right or wrong. And the way that WHO have done that around vaccines and vaccine equity, I think, is a very powerful way in which the international discourse, debate, dialogue can move countries to do things. But ultimately it rests, solutions to this, I think, rest in country, and it requires investment in education and in faculty. It requires investments to support people to go into education and to just their tuition or living expenses to be able to afford to do that. I think it's difficult, because Jim says that those places that have moved away from education being a free good, and I think that we should look at incentives. But the sorts of incentives, I think, are people's commitment then to a lifetime of service in nursing, or however many years, and then have payback on all of that as well. And the reality as well, I think, from what I see in places like Africa, where we clearly need a significant scale up in education, if we sit around thinking that would come one day from governments and from the public purse, it won't happen. It will, the more immediate scale up will require partnerships between public and private sectors. And some people may feel uncomfortable with the ideology of all of that, but I think it's the reality of making it happen, which then means, so if that is going to make sure we put the rules of the game in place, that there are quality standards for these educational institutions that are supported to develop.
Thank you, Howard. Iddy, I'm going to go to you because we had a question from Primrose Magala, who was talking about education that we've been talking about, and saying that is maybe education part of the education gaps and differences, are part of the challenges with recruitment and retention. And certainly, I was in Spain not very long, well, before the pandemic, talking to some of their Nursing Now groups. And one of the issues they highlighted was a lot of them had been to the UK and done quite a lot of continuing education. Then they went back to Spain and they weren't able to practice to use the skills they learned. And that was very frustrating for them. So they were, basically saying, we don't want to stay, we want to go and do something else. So Primrose was asking or saying that she thinks this may be the case in Trinidad and Tobago. So what's your take on these ideas? You're working really on the front line here.
Yes, definitely. That is a major concern for nurses who return to practice within Trinidad and Tobago. The few that return, even those who come from Cuba, they are actually trained at a higher basic level than the local nurses, and they feel very constrained in what they can do when they come into our settings, because our regulations really debar a number of activities that they would have been accustomed doing in their native land when they come to Trinidad. So that is definitely a nice reason why we are focusing on getting the nursing personal regulations amended and all the different aspects of legislation that affect nursing and midwives. So education is definitely concerned, and also the quality and the certification of our nurse lecturers, because we are a developing country, because we are a country that exports our best and brightest. More senior level nurses who are in a position to teach and educate the younger nurses have migrated. So we really there was an extreme difficulty in finding oncology, nurses with oncology and masters or what have you, to really train the junior nurses, because all of them would have migrated. So we actually have to employ masters in Canada to do our oncology training. We had to work partner with England through Mount Vernon Cancer Society, a number of other institutions, to get our nurses trained. And unfortunately, when they are trained, they end up leaving. So we don't have that cadre, that group of professionals really to supervise. But also I wanted to touch on one aspect in terms of the export of nursing personnel, because as how it actually led for countries. And there was actually a study done in 2005 by the Caribbean on Health Development, where they looked at that very point to let we can export nurses as a viable product and get this. Has been on the cards. It hasn't really materialized. The export of nurses really has been left up to each individual person. Actually, we would have been in contact with a number of nursing agencies from the UK, from the USA, contacting the association to assist them in recruiting. And one of the things we said, well, if you're going to take our nurses, assist us. Let's partner with some of the universities locally to assist in ramping up training. And those receiving countries could contribute to the training of nursing personnel. Well, from the minute we brought that proposal, we stopped hearing from those recruiters. So that is from our neck of the woods how we view stuff.
Iddy, thank you so much. You really raised the critical points, I think. We have to stop here, colleagues. I'm terribly sorry to say. We've got loads of wonderful questions in the chat. Howard, we did have somebody ask, is that ILO webinar going to be available to watch online? I mean, on the web?
Yeah, yes. If we haven't already, it will be up. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Howard. And this will be as well for everybody. This has been the most wonderful way to end our season of advocacy and almost our whole season of Nursing Now webinars. You have made history, and thank you so very much, panelists, for taking part. It's been a very rich and informative discussion, and we've already had lots of great feedback. And so don't forget to register for our end of campaign event on the 24th of May and look for the launch of our Nursing Now report. Thank you again, guys. See you next time.